So, living biologically, that is a phrase which I guess I invented. I did not realize I invented it because I thought I had gotten it from somewhere else. But then I looked at the source of the comment where I thought I'd gotten it from, and I realized they had worded it slightly differently. Um, but it's a perfect expression of what we're trying to escape on a personal and individual level. What is living biologically? Some people look at that and they're like, "What?" They're like, "What? Is Caleb into organic chemistry? Like, is Caleb, some kind of physiologist or something? What is living biologically? What is this? Is the hard sciences?" Well, what we mean by living biologically is that um, human beings are capable of both being alive in the spiritual sense as well as the biological sense. And that much of society in our time, I would argue, has been reduced to only living in the biological sense. And many people find that highly unfulfilling. When we talk about living in the biological sense, life has a biological definition. Plants are alive. Trees are alive. Weeds are alive. Roses are alive. Insects are alive. Ants are alive. Insects are living. Flies. Mammals are alive. Dogs are alive. Cats are alive. Donkeys are alive. Camels are alive. Horses are alive. But none of them are alive in the same way that a human is. None of them. None of these other forms of life ever stop and say, "Why am I here?" And none of them ever grasp and wrangle with big questions. And when it really gets down to it, none of these other life forms go beyond responding to stimuli, right? If something is painful, you avoid it. If something is pleasurable, you seek it. And that's what the entities in this world that are simply living biologically do, is they seek pleasure, they avoid pain, and that is their existence. And their existence is almost predetermined. They have so little agency that they almost exist in the same way that the waves on the ocean exist. There's a wave in the ocean. It goes in, it goes out. The wave doesn't stop and go, "Should I go in or out?" No, it just goes in and out, right? And that, you look at the way ants live, and you look at the way trees live. I mean, they're more or less like the wave on the ocean. They just go. They don't exercise any agency or make any decision. However, human beings are different. And the evidence that human beings are different and not simply living in the biological sense is that we force the environment to serve us. Frederick Engels, in his essay on the role played by labor in the transition from ape to man, he talked about how all other species simply interact with their environment, but man masters the environment and forces the environment to serve him. And it is this final distinction that separates man from other species. man forces the environment to serve him with his labor power and with his creativity. And in fact, human beings are constantly reinventing the way we interact with nature. Ants have been making their ant farms the same way for thousands of years. Beavers have been making their beaver dams the same way for thousands of years. Bees have been growing their beehives and making their beehives the same way for thousands of years. But human beings have the ability to take their environment and reinvent it, force it to serve them, and reinvent it. And the history of humanity has been going from one mode of production to another, going from one energy source to another, increasing our population, increasing our life expectancy, increasing the level of comfort in life, and learning to interact with our environment in a more efficient way. We've gone from burning wood to burning coal to burning petroleum, gasoline, and now nuclear power has emerged, and fusion could be next, right? We've gone from hunter-gatherer civilization to slavery, to feudalism, to industrial capitalism. And now we're seeing the rise of a more planned economy emerging around the world in parts of the world that have broken out of the monopolistic capitalism of the West. And that human beings are constantly looking at the world around them and saying, how can we do better? Asking big questions, learning about how the world works, and innovating and reinventing their relationship with nature. And that's what it really means to be human. However, we live in an era where the people at the top have decided game over. The people at the top of the world have decided that for the sake of them being at the top forever, human progress must end. It's like a game of King of the Mountain. They're at the top and they've declared game over. Because if humanity continues to rise and innovate, which we will, that means they'll be displaced. And the people at the top of the world right now are oil monopolists, oil bankers, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts, the Carnegies. The people at the top of the world right now are the tech monopolies, Bill Gates, the Apple billionaires, the Silicon Valley elite. People at the top of the world are the Anglo-American establishment, the old colonial money, the ultra-rich, and they're at the top of the world. And they're at the top of the world because they dominate a global system of free trade, banking, and control of the international oil markets. Oil is the main way they've cornered their monopoly. Oil is the most important commodity in the world today, and most of it they control, right? The oil in America is in their hands. The oil in Nigeria is in their hands. The oil in Saudi Arabia is more or less in their hands. They do have to negotiate with the monarchy. The oil in Britain, the oil in Norway and Denmark is in their hands. They have their dominance over the world. And because they have their dominance over the world, they dominate the international oil markets. They dominate the international banking system. They dominate the global economy. They are determined to stop countries around the world that have broken out of their domination. Countries like China, like Russia, like Venezuela, like Iran, like Nicaragua, like the Union of Sahel States, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso on the African continent. They're determined to keep those countries under their grip and to beat down those countries because they don't want to be displaced. And if human progress continues, and if human beings continue to do what we naturally do very well, innovate, create, reinvent our relationship with nature, we're going to get beyond oil as the main energy source. We're going to get beyond a world that's centered around Wall Street and London. And we're going to move toward a world where the human population is greatly expanded, the life expectancy is greatly expanded, and they're no longer secure in their monopoly. We will move from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. We will move from a world that is centered around a mighty city, and will move toward a world that is centered around civilization on the land and governments that encourage development upon the land. Not a global economy ruled by those who control the trade routes, but rather a global economy that is dominated by development upon the land, and not a sea based thalassocracy, but a telerocracy. And a land based civilization focused on development rather than a sea based civilization based on military force controlling trade. That is the inevitable direction that humanity is moving at this time. And it means they're out of luck. It means they don't get to be the boss anymore. It means they don't get to maintain their dominance. And so the leaders of the Western system have determined that the only hope they have is to reduce humanity overall to a biological existence. They are openly talking about depopulation. They're openly saying that there are too many people in the world. They are openly talking about creating some kind of dystopian future where we are controlled through our phones and dazzled into compliance, where we own nothing and are happy about it, and we live in a pod and we eat bugs. They are openly talking out various dystopian scenarios for a high-tech dark ages, because that's the only way they can stay at the top, because their rule is at odds with human progress. Human progress will continue, but their rule will not. And as a result of that, they would like to reduce us to being rats in a maze. They would like us to be reduced to living biologically. And humanity will not accept that. And that is the conflict that is going on. And many people, on an individual level, very much let their lives be governed by others. I'm really into Wallace Wattles. Wallace Wattles is considered one of the most important thinkers of the New Thought and self-help movement. He was also a socialist, friend of Eugene Debs. He ran for office on a socialist platform. And on top of that, he was also a Christian, and he wrote 2 books about Jesus Christ and Jesus' teachings. Wallace D. Wattles. And I'm actually going to read to you one of my favorite passages from a Wallace Wattles book, because it's very, very relevant to this whole question of living biologically. It really just gets to the essence of what we're talking about. So here, I'll put it on. All right, I'll read to you the quotation, because it really gets to the essence of it. Hold your horses. Just got to find the text here. Here we go. Pulling up the quote. Okay. Well, this is in the public domain, but I'm having trouble finding the text. But here we go. Here we go. Or not. Okay. Here we go. All right. Very good. I'll read you this quote. This kind of summarizes what I'm getting at about living biologically. Let me just find the quotation that I'm looking for. It's a good one. Thank you for being patient with me here on Friday night, everybody. I do appreciate it. Some nights I get on here all fired up about politics. Other nights I get on here talking about vampire movies. Other nights I get on here talking about who knows what. But tonight I decided to get on here and talk about living biologically and what I have come to understand about what it means to be human. And, that's what I'm on here to talk about tonight. And so I appreciate you being patient as I pull up the quotation. Doo-doo-doo. Wow, it is just not being helpful here. I don't know why. Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. Here we go. All right. Here we go. There are two mental attitudes a man may take. One makes him like a football. It has resilience and it reacts strongly when force is applied to it, but it originates nothing. It never acts of itself. There is no power within it. Men of this type are controlled by circumstances and environment. Their destinies are decided by things external to themselves. The principle of power within them is never really active at all. They never speak or act from within. The other attitude makes man like a flowing spring. Power comes from the center of him. He has within him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. He radiates force. He is felt by his environment. The principle of power in him has him in constant action. He is self active. He hath life within himself. All right? So, do you want to be a football and live biologically, or do you want to be a flowing spring with life flowing out of you? Well, if you're capable of being happy living biologically, then that's what you should be doing. But for those of us who are not happy, because there are many people nowadays that are not happy, they are looking for more meaning in life. The way to find that is to stop living biologically, stop being a football, and start being a flowing spring. So many people are unhappy with their lives because they are simply going through the motions. They do this, they do that, and they feel a certain way. And this thing, I must say, and the way we're all plugged in is a really, really effective mechanism for reducing people to a biological existence. All right. They talk about how your phone can tell your mood. They talk about how your phone and the algorithms can impact your mood. And the forces of evil know what they're doing. And part of reducing people to being in a state of being without agency, without power, is subjecting them to this 24-hour social engineering operation, money-making operation, also called the algorithm. And part of awakening and taking on a human existence is making a dramatic decision and saying, I am going to take control of my life. And in order to take control of my life, I'm going to take control of my mind. I am going to see what I choose to see. I am going to think about what I choose to think about. I am going to engage with the ideas that I choose to engage with. I'm not just going to look at whatever my phone shows me. I'm not going to feel just however the world around me has decided I am to feel. I am not going to act and understand the world the way everything around me, everything being pumped at me tells me to. I will make a conscious decision. For a long time, I told people to get out of their bubble. I don't say that anymore. I say make your own bubble. You're going to be in a bubble one way or another. You can't see everything in the world, but you have to decide what your bubble is. You have to say, my bubble is going to consist of this. I am going to try and feel this way. I am going to listen to this reality. I'm going to learn about this. I am going to engage with this. You have to pick your own bubble, and you have to do it consciously. You can't let the algorithm decide for you. You can't let Satan make your bubble for you. You must decide your own bubble. And it's funny because people hear this and they say, Caleb, this is cult brainwashing. Caleb, this is authoritarianism. No, you are the boss. Authoritarianism is somebody else is the boss. And if you let them run your life, you're letting them be the boss. I'm telling you, you can make the decision. How is that authoritarian? That's the ultimate freedom. I'm telling you that you should consciously decide what you listen to, consciously decide what you watch, consciously decide how it is that you are going to be made to feel, consciously decide what to learn about and what to think about, consciously decide what your life goals are. I am telling you to take control of your own life. I am telling you to exercise the ultimate freedom. But that means not letting them drive. And whenever they don't get to be the boss, it's totalitarianism. And that's how these things work, right? They rule by default, right? For example, great example. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago about the concept of, it called it democratic regression. And it gave the example of Russia and Venezuela as two countries that experienced democratic regression. What is democratic regression, according to this academic quoted in the Wall Street Journal? Well, according to them, democratic regression is when a society that is open and democratic through voting becomes a dictatorship and authoritarian. And I thought, wait a second. Wait, hold up. If you vote for it, how is that dictatorship? And the article went on to explain. It said in Venezuela, they had a free election and they voted for Hugo Chavez. And Hugo Chavez got elected, and he then tampered with the independent institutions, such as the economy, the police, the military, the media. And the independent institutions of Venezuela were changed by the elected leader. So it was no longer democracy. And I thought about it and I said, wait a second. So they voted for him to change society. He got into office, he changed society, and that's dictatorship. And they said, yes, but it's because the independent institutions were tampered with. Well, they weren't independent institutions. The military of Venezuela used to take orders from the American military. The economy of Venezuela used to be controlled by American oil companies. Venezuela in the 1990s had huge austerity because the International Monetary Fund would tell them every year, if you want to get more loans, you've got to privatize this and you've got to lay off this many people. It wasn't independent before. They were just in charge. But then when Venezuela elected a leader who started to change that and said, well, no, the Venezuelan military is going to get trained in Cuba. And no, we're going to nationalize and use the oil to benefit Venezuela. Well, then it's authoritarianism. It's dictatorship because they don't rule by default. Right? And Russia was a similar thing. In the 1990s, according to this article, Russia was a free and open society. That's interesting. I mean, mass hunger, the population was decreasing. I think they lost roughly 10% of their population in the 1990s. Mass unemployment, like 30% unemployment, but it was a free and open society. Okay. But then they had a fair and democratic election. Putin was elected. But then when he got elected, he changed society. Well, that's why the people voted for him. They wanted him to change society, but he changed society. And suddenly these independent institutions, like Russia's oil and gas, like the security services, like the military, he took control of them. And they were just independent before, when British Petroleum was looting Russia's oil and oligarchs were, getting state industries, that was independent. But then Putin created Gazprom and Rosneft, and all of a sudden it's authoritarianism, right? And the security services in Russia were At that point, under Putin's leadership, we're working very, very hard to stabilize the country and not let the oligarchs. Well, that's authoritarianism, right? And you look at it, it's authoritarianism when they don't get to be in charge. And the most blatant example of that is I'm telling you here, take control of your own life. Decide what you will read, decide what you will listen to, decide what you want to think about, decide what you want to feel, make your own bubble and do so actively. And that's not authoritarianism. That is individual control of your life. But they'll tell you it's authoritarianism. They'll tell you it's a cult because what you're supposed to do is just sit back and let them drive. And when they drive, they're not driving. That's just the way it naturally is. They're not in charge or anything. The big tech monopolies that run everything, the big corporations that run the media, the foreign policy think tanks that make plans for World War III. No, they don't do anything. It just naturally happens. The way the world is, that's just how it is. Some people are rich and some people are poor. Some countries are impoverished and some countries are very, very wealthy. That's just how it is, right? And well, it's not just how it is. There are systems. There are realities. There are relationships. There is an economy. And things aren't just the way they are. We have rulers in this world. The international monopolies, the big banks and corporations that dominate the world, they rule. And in order to maintain their rule, they want to drive down the population and they want to shove the beauty of human creativity and the beauty of human intelligence back into the box. That's what they're trying to do. And I'm here to tell you that if you want to fulfill what it means to be human, you can't simply take on a biological existence, and that the Center for Political Innovation exists to awaken people and empower people to discover their humanness and question and join a movement of other people that are committed to building a world where human innovation and creativity is cultivated. And human beings, as the source of all wealth, with our labor power and our innovation, that we're unleashed, and we create a world that allows communities to flourish. We want a pro-humanity, pro-growth government, a government that breaks the power of these big monopolies and invests in the people and in the communities. We want a government of action that fights for working families. We want an anti-monopoly coalition. And that was a great thing. But it requires you to awaken. It's not something you're going to just naturally do. Maybe at some point, our movement will be big enough that people will just kind of join it because it's there. But right now, getting involved in our organization and getting involved in the movement to free humanity from the rule of imperialist monopolies, well, that's a choice. It requires you to awaken and actively decide things. And I appreciate that you're here. That means you're capable of doing it. So I wanted to, for the remainder of my remarks, my opening remarks tonight, I wanted to go over some concepts I've talked about before a long time ago. It's been 3-4 years since I've talked about this concept on these streams. But, I wanted to revisit a concept that I spoke about a couple years ago. Before I do that, I'll remind you, if you have a question for the second half of the show, buy me a coffee is the best way to do it. Buy me a coffee/Caleb Maupin. You can also do the Rumble rants, or you can cash at me at Caleb Maupin 22. About 3-4 years ago on this channel, I can't believe we're at over 1,000 live streams now. Isn't that wild? 1,000 live streams. Thank you all for being here and being part of this community. 1,000 live streams. That's great. Well, several hundred live streams ago, probably maybe over 500 live streams ago, I did a live stream where I talked about 4 forms of Satanism. And that was before I got too religious on these streams. I talked about 4 forms of Satanism. And it was interesting because Satanists got really angry about it. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Literal Satanist blogs were so angry about my thing. They wrote like whole screeds against it. No one got more offended by my stream about the 4 forms of Satanism than the Satanists. And I think generally, if you're offending the Satanists, that's generally a good thing. If people are self-proclaimed Satanists and you are offending them, That generally is a good thing. And so I just want to revisit the 4 forms of Satanism that I went over um, on this channel a long time ago. I argued that what we call Satanism, right? Uh, eh, what you can call Satan has 4 incarnations, right? That every religion tends to talk about the other, right? You know, every religion talks about some kind of force for good, and then there's the opponent. And what does that mean? And I argue there are 4 expressions of the opponent that exist. And the first one is actually good. The first form of Satanism is healthy, and that is the troubleshooter, the questioner, the critic, right? Nothing will be able to maintain its strength if it's never challenged. And this is something that I think Hegel talked about and other things. But, if you were a really good basketball player, but there was never a team for you to play against that challenged you, you would lose your ability to be a good basketball player, right? If Michael Jordan, he was a really good basketball player, but then they made a rule from now on he can only play basketball with kindergartners. Give it 4 or 5 years, Michael Jordan would suck at basketball because he was never challenged, right? Right? And that strength requires opposition. Your ideas are not going to be firm if you never have to defend them in an argument. You never have somebody say, well, I'm not sure about that. What about this? You need to be challenged. You need to be countered. You need somebody asking the tough questions. You need somebody who troubleshoots, somebody who says, wait, what about this? Someone who pokes holes in your argument. You need somebody who pushes back and challenges you. You need to be put into hard situations, right? And that is actually what the traditional Jewish teaching on Satan was, right? The book of Job in the Old Testament of the Bible tells the story of Satan not as this enemy of God, but rather as one of God's angels whose job it is to put you through hardship to test your loyalty to God. In the book of Job Job is this very, very faithful, loyal man. And Satan, the angel, says, well, I don't know how faithful he is, God. Let me make his life very, very hard. And Job is subjected to a lot of hardship, and that is testing his loyalty, right? And that healthy Satanism, you need opposition. And you can't have good without bad. You can't have light without dark. This is the unity of opposites in the Hegelian sense, right? You can't have, if there was no dark, there could be no light. If there was no tall, there could be no short, right? If there was no fat, there could be no skinny, right? That there are a lot of realities that define themselves by their opposite, by their opposite. And if you want to thrive, you need to be challenged. You need to face opposition. There is a contradictory nature to reality, right? And so to some degree, what you can call the enemy or the opponent or whatever is good for you. You should be thankful that you've been challenged. You should be thankful that you've had hardship in your life. You should be thankful for the person who pushed you to do more than you could. You should be thankful for the person who made you discover your own strength by having to push back against them. In some ways, facing an opponent, facing opposition, facing a challenge is really, really important in order to thrive. And so that's the healthy form of Satanism, right? That you need opposition, and opposition is vital for any organization, any movement, any individual, anything. In order to maintain its strength, must face opposition. So that's the first thing. There's the healthy form of Satanism. Then there's a second form of Satanism that exists, and this second form of Satanism is actually, it's interesting. A couple months ago, somebody in the audience, shout out to you, told me that there's actually a psychoanalytic term for this, counterwill. Right? And I called it adolescent Satanism, teenage Satanism, contrarianism, but there's actually a psychoanalytic term for it, which is counterwill. which is young people in particular, but everybody, when it really gets down to it, pushes back against restrictions that they are given, right? And that we are often attracted to things that we are told is bad, right? It's like the great example, right? If you put up a poster everywhere that says, don't think about polar bears, everyone's going to look at that poster and immediately think about polar bears. That's just how it works, right? When you see a poster that says, don't think about polar bears, you go, I wonder what it is about polar bears they're telling me not to think about. And people then pull out polar bears, Google polar bears. That's just how it works, right? If you tell people not to do something, they want to do it. And this is a basic human behavior, but a lot of politics that is shitty is based on this kind of thinking, right? And unfortunately, communism in America attracts a lot of people for that reason. Communism is described as the devil, so you get a lot of people who want to be the devil because it's literal Satanism. Why do you think it is? Ozzy Osbourne and Slayer and these rock bands from the 70s and 80s had devil horns and 666 and all of that. What do you think that was about? Well, it was because all these teenagers who wanted to make their Christian or evangelical or conservative parents mad, they all looked into that, right? They all and that there's one element of Satanism which is just contrarianism, adolescent rebellion, counter will. And it's not good to indulge in that, right? We shouldn't be doing things just because it's deemed bad. And that you can't hold an organization together and you can't be a happy person, right? If you can't agree with anybody. And that yes, no one likes to be controlled. No one likes to be told what to do, and we all naturally push back against it. But if you overindulge that, it's going to be impossible to maintain friendships. It's going to be impossible for you to get anything done in this world, right? That part of what it means to be human is to learn to work with other people, learn to compromise with the world as it exists, and figure out how you can get what you want and the world or the other person or the environment can get what they want, right? And that this drive that seems to define a lot of people become overcome by this drive of no one will tell me what to do. No one will tell me what to do. I will think for myself. And a lot of people become overwhelmed by it, and it's a destructive force, right? There's 3 or 4 people I've known over the years, and it would annoy me at the same time, but now I just kind of laugh about it. And it was when I was very, very intensely devoted to communism. There'd be people I would know, I would become friends with, and then I would randomly get a text from them one day. Just so you know, I don't agree with communism. I text them back. I didn't think you did. Don't worry. Well, yeah, but I think and what they're telling me is they are starting to agree with my ideas, but they have to protect themselves, right? They have to be independent, right? They can't possibly admit that anyone else taught them anything. And it's a young man problem more than anything. A lot of young men don't want anyone else to be their leader, don't want anyone else to tell them anything, don't want to acknowledge that they learned from anybody. It's hard. And if you watch the movie Malcolm X, right, which is not historically accurate, there's many problems with that film, but in the movie Malcolm X, there's a historically inaccurate moment in the film where this didn't happen, right? So it was made up for the film. But I think the reason they put it in the film is because it spoke to people, is that when Malcolm X is in the prison and he converts to Islam, he just can't get on his knees and do the Islamic prayer because he's too proud. He's too arrogant, right? And that as somebody who's, fought and been a gangster and been a criminal, he just can't bring himself to do what they call the salat in Islam, where they do the praying, they like kneel, they pray, he just can't do it. Well, that didn't happen, right? And the Nation of Islam are the first to tell you that did not happen, because the Nation of Islam doesn't do that, right? They don't do salat. So, there's no way that actually happened, but that's in the movie. And it's true, right? That a lot of young men, especially, they feel like they're kind of at war with the world. They put up a tough wall. No one. And so, the idea of this religion I mean, Islam is literally called the way of submission, right? That's what it translates to. It's all about submission, right? And that this religion is telling him to get on his knees and pray to God and acknowledge that God is the all-powerful force. And it's hard for him. And I think that they put that in the movie, even though it didn't actually happen, because it speaks to a lot of people's experience. And it also speaks to why religion is very, very fulfilling for many young men when they become religious, when they really truly become religious, not when they start wearing a cross around their neck because it shows all the woke people. No, when they really truly become religious, it's very fulfilling because they can let their guard down, because they cannot have to feel like they're fighting the world, and they can just embrace God, their father, God, their heavenly parent, who is there for them, and they can put their guard down and feel safe, right? And it's actually very, very fulfilling for many young men when they do find religion. That was my experience, absolutely. When I, reconnected with God in 2015, it was a huge relief for me because I didn't have to feel like I was at war with the universe anymore. I could be at one and at peace with my heavenly parent, and that is a fulfilling thing. And it's about rejecting that second manifestation of Satanism, which is the counterwill, which is the drive to go against, the drive to push back against everything, the drive to assert your independence at all costs. That's the second form of Satanism. Now, the third form of Satanism, which I think is probably the most deadly form of Satanism, and I also think is the most literal form of Satanism, is ideological Satanism. And this is literally the belief of the Church of Satan. So, like, this is actually Satanism, right? If you want to look up Anton LaVey, the guy who opened the Church of Satanism, what did he believe? He believed that human beings are just another animal, right? That's actually a literal quote from the Satanic Bible. Man is just another animal, sometimes better, but often worse than those who walk on all fours. And that selfishness is a virtue. Selfishness is a virtue. Compassion and kindness and altruism are weaknesses. And that you should be blatantly selfish. You should be completely indifferent to other people's suffering. And you should put yourself above all else. You should suppress any empathy within your soul. You should view other humans as just objects that you can manipulate to get what you want. You should be a sociopath, right? That's what the Church of Satan believes. And the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, says that his greatest inspiration was Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, right? Born Anita Rosenbaum in the Russian Empire, saw her father humiliated by the Bolsheviks. Her father was a chemist who owned a chemistry plant factory. And after the revolution, when there was huge shortages of housing and there was millions of people were dying during the Russian Civil War, the Bolsheviks came and they pointed guns at them and said, you have to share your mansion with other people that have lost their families. And she watched her father, who she looked up to, a chemist, kind of a self-made man, a small business owner who had a little factory. She saw him humiliated by the Bolshevik army, and she was traumatized by that. And she moved to the United States of America. She, studied film in the Soviet Union, and she got a visa to come to the United States of America. And she came to the United States of America to live with her relatives in Chicago, and they noticed something was off about Anita. That in Chicago in the 1920s, when she moved to Chicago as a young woman, there was a man named William Hickman. And William Hickman had strangled his wife to death, murdered his wife. And the judge told William Hickman, we will not give you the death penalty if you can show remorse. And William Hickman said, I have no remorse. And he was hanged for killing his wife. And Ayn Rand, Anita Rosenbaum, loved William Hickman and had photos of William Hickman all over her. And she was just in awe of this wife strangler. Something was off about Anita Rosenbaum, Ayn Rand. Something was off about her. Then she moved to Hollywood, where she worked in a film studio. And, she was like a typist and a secretary in a screenwriter's office. And, but then she wrote a novel. And she wrote this novel called The Fountainhead. And this novel is about an architect, and this architect designs buildings in a non-conforming way, so no one ever builds his buildings. And he's just so bold and defiant and breaking with the norms, and how he makes his buildings that, people don't appreciate him and don't understand him. So he's forced to work in a coal mine. And while he's working so hard in the coal mine, there's this rich girl who's supposed to be Ayn Rand, who has a crush on him, and rides by the coal mine in her horse and sees him laboring away and is just turned on by him. So one day, the hero Howard Rourke breaks into her apartment, smashes the windows of her apartment, and comes in and violently rapes her. Right. And it's portrayed in Ayn Rand's narration as this heroic event, and the strong man took what was his, and the woman couldn't resist. It's the most twisted, demented, and Ayn Rand eventually, when the House Un-American Activities Committee got going, she started testifying and squealing on her fellow screenwriters who were members of the Communist Party. And she eventually started her own religion, right? Or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, objectivism. And the first pledge of objectivism is that I say that I will only be true to myself. I will never think of anyone else. She wrote a book called The Virtue of Selfishness. The Virtue of Selfishness. Ayn Rand, Anita Rosenbaum, sociopath, politicized and philosophized sociopathy, if there ever was such a thing, right? That is ideological Satanism. Malthusianism, the idea that human beings are a cancer on Mother Earth, and that we need to drive down the population, and that we should breed people like animals, and that the inferior people need to just die off because they'll pass on their genes, and we shouldn't have compassion. That's ideological Satanism. Malthusianism, individual, a radical extreme individualism, might makes right, really philosophical irrationalism, the teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the idea that morality doesn't exist. It's just something imposed by the weak to restrain the strong, and that the great heroes of history don't live by any rules, don't live by any truth, and just impose their will upon the world, right? Philosophical irrationalism, that is ideological Satanism, right? Friedrich Nietzsche, who celebrated the horrendous crimes of colonialism because he said that, this is just man, European man reasserting his strength. He's going away from these Christian pretenses, this notion of morality, and he's returning to his heroic might makes right self. This is ideological Satanism. This is evil, right? It's evil in political, philosophical, economic, ideological form, right? And this is what literal Satanists believe. And on the right, it is packaged as Ayn Rand and objectivism for conservatives and small business owners, the Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. And on the left, it's called postmodernism, and it's handed to you by Theodor Adorno. It's handed to you by the Frankfurt School. It's handed to you by ContraPoints and BreadTube. And it is this belief that right and wrong do not exist. With our willpower, we can define reality. Most human beings are evil, creatures that would try to hold you back. The great people rule over the inferior ones, and the great society is societies like America, where the great ones can rise to the top, and those people down at the bottom have no ability to hold them back. This is what Leo Strauss, the founder of neoconservatism, believed, right? His book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, is basically arguing that point. Leo Strauss was a Platonic philosopher who was the mentor to all the big neocons. He taught that, that all the great philosophers of history have written in code, have had to write in code, because if the average people knew what they said, they would burn them at the stake, they would persecute them, and that some people are just naturally better than others. They're the philosopher kings, like Plato wrote about in his Republic, and that what makes free societies and good societies is societies that let the philosopher kings come to the top and restrain and hold back the inferior rabble who would get in their way. Contrary to standard Western discourse, Leo Strauss, as well as Irving Kristol and the whole neocon school, views Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as equal, as the same, and both as examples of upsurges of democracy, excesses of democracy, right? That the Soviet Union incarnated what ordinary people have in their souls. Nazi Germany incarnated what ordinary people have in their souls. It was ordinary people unleashed to rule over the great ones. That's what they believe Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were. And that America is great because the inferior rabble are brainwashed. The inferior rabble don't understand it, and we let the philosopher kings rule over us. That is the neoconservative doctrine. That is what neocons believe. And they believe that America is great because we're not democratic, is whatever sense that makes. America is great because there is not a mechanism through which the superior ones can be restrained, and that America is a world where most of us, inferior rabble, just know our place. That is ideological Satanism. These ideas, philosophical irrationalism, the neoconservative perspective, postmodernism, objectivist Ayn Rand stuff. This is literal Satanism. This is what like actual Satanists believe. This is contrary to any notion of morality. When it really gets down to it, folks, law and morality are the only things that protect the weak from the strong. Now, people hear me say that and they say, well, Caleb, we all know that the law, unfairly treats the weak. That's true. That is absolutely true. We all know that morality is preached by hypocrites, right? That, the people preaching morality, Caleb, if Penny is watching, she's probably saying, well, Caleb, there's all these churches out there that preach morality and support Israel's crimes. And she's right. Law is corrupt. Morality is corrupt. The laws of America are written by the rich people to protect the rich people, and they are corrupt. That's true. And the people that have a platform to extol morality are hypocrites, and they preach a morality and a worldview that reinforces the status quo. You're not wrong in any of that. But the issue isn't that law should be abolished. It's that law should be made to be just law. And the issue isn't that we shouldn't have morality. The issue is that we should have true morality. And that if you completely abolish law and you completely abolish morality, what you get is the strong ruthlessly ruling over the weak with no restraint, right? When there's an old woman crossing the street, right, and there's a young, strong man there who wants to take her purse, there are two things that stop him from doing so. One is morality. He thinks that's a nice old lady. I don't have a right to beat her up and take her purse. That would make me a bad person. That might be what I want to do, but that would make me not nice. I have empathy and compassion for the old lady. I'm not going to beat her up and take her purse. But if he has no morality, there's a second thing that stops him from beating her up and taking her purse, and that is, if they catch me, I might go to jail for doing so. Law and morality stops the big, strong young man from punching the old lady and taking her purse. If you get rid of morality, if that big, strong man, it never occurs to him, that's not a nice thing to do. Don't take the old lady's purse. It never occurs to him. He's just been told his whole life, hey, might makes right. The strong rule over the weak, right? Compassion is weak. Well, he's going to take her purse. And if there's no law, right, there's no consequence for him doing so. If there's no one who's going to say that's stealing, young man, and throw him in jail for punching the old lady and taking her purse, what's going to stop him from doing so? If you abolish law and you abolish morality, what you get is the law of the jungle. What you get is the strong ruthlessly ruling over the weak with no restraint. That's what you get. The whole reason that we have law, the whole reason that we have morality is so we can at least pretend, or at least try on some level, to not have the strong ruthlessly rule over the weak. There's a quote on the wall of the U.S. Department of Justice. I'm not a big fan generally of how the U.S. Department of Justice operates, but there's a quote that they have in Washington, D.C. I walked by it when I was working in D.C., and I said, I like that quote. And it says, where law stops, tyranny begins. And that is the truth. Without law, you have tyranny. You have absolute tyranny. Law is an attempt to restrict tyranny. It's not perfect, and it's often corrupted, and it often, it can be misused and exercised in a tyrannical way, but it's at least some basic human attempt to not have the tyranny of the strong over the weak, and the same for morality. And ideological Satanism opposes both law and morality, right? Ideological Satanism says right and wrong don't exist, and might makes right, and just be selfish and don't have compassion. Ideological Satanism says we don't need no stinking government to pass child labor laws, or pass a minimum wage, and we don't need, and that that if you abolish law and you abolish morality, you get might makes right. You get the strong ruling over the weak, and that is Satanism, and that's what they openly want. So that's the third form of Satanism is that ideological Satanism, which is liberalism. It's liberalism taken to its extreme degree. Liberalism is good, right? Liberalism is the belief in individual rights. It's what the revolutions that defined the Western world were about. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the English Civil War, John Locke, right? Liberalism was necessary. We needed to have free speech in this world. We needed to have freedom of religion in this world. We needed to have freedom of assembly. We needed to have freedom of conscience. But if one takes individual rights and blows it up to an extreme where you're negating any sense of collectivism, where you're saying that human beings are not collective creatures, as Margaret Thatcher said, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals. That's a literal quote from Margaret Thatcher. There's no such thing as society. That's Winston Churchill. There's no such thing as society. There's only individuals. If that's what you believe, you're going to end up with this. And that's what it is. If there's no such thing as society, only individuals, society has no right to tell you what's right and wrong or to have a moral code. And society certainly doesn't have the right to, protect people and enforce laws. And that's what you get, right? And this is ideological Satanism, the mentality of radical individualism that seeks to abolish law and morality, that seeks to abolish any collective obligation, that celebrates the individual above all else, and views humanity with contempt. That is the third form. That is ideological Satanism. It calls itself postmodernism, calls itself libertarianism, calls itself objectivism, calls itself philosophical irrationalism. It calls itself many, many different things. Neoconservatism, objectivism, whatever you want to call it, that's Satan. But there is a fourth form. There's a fourth form of Satanism. And that fourth form of Satanism it's not an idea. It's a feeling. It's something that is very hard to define. But it's something we all know. It's the part of you that is working against you. And I think you know what I'm talking about. Because there are many of us that when we go to try something new and exciting, a voice in our head says, don't. You're going to fail. Everyone's going to laugh at you. There's some people, when they wake up in the morning, there's a voice in their head that says, why are you getting up and going into this world? Everyone's going to treat you badly. No one likes you. Why do you even show your face? There's a part of you that is demoralized. There's a part of you that doesn't want you to look to the future with hope. There's a part of you that is working against yourself. And I think it exists for all of us to some degree. And perhaps it's in its healthiest form. It's kind of like that first thing. It's just a natural questioner. We all should question ourselves, right? We shouldn't be overconfident. Overconfidence can kill you. But if you have been abused, if you had an abusive parent, if you were bullied, if you had an older sibling who put you down or a younger sibling who put you down, this can get amplified. It can get amplified. This part of your mind that is rooting against you, this part of your mind that is rooting against you, that is demoralized, that is hopeless, that is trying to prevent you from moving forward with life, prevent you from making new connections, prevent you from going out and achieving things, prevent you from finding fulfillment, prevent you from risking and trying that part of your mind that is working against you, right? If you have trauma in your past, if you have people who have mistreated you, um, it can be amplified. And in fact, it can take on those people's very words, right? It can take on the words of the abusive parent. It can take on the words of the bully. It can take on the words of the person who has harmed you, right? And that all of us to some degree, for some people it's harder than others, but all of us to some degree, in order to achieve what we have achieved, we have to push back against that voice. We have to fight back against it. We have to say no to that part of our brain that wants to demoralize us. No to that part of our brain that tells us there's no hope. No to that part of the brain that says that there's no reason to get up in the morning, that there's nothing to go for, that everyone's judging you. We have to fight against that part of the brain. And it's not easy. And it requires strength and energy and passion to do it. But it must be done. It must be done. But I'm here to tell you, you're not meant to fight that part of your mind in isolation. You need other people. You need other people. Other people. And the connection that you find in other people and the encouragement that you can get from having a true friend or a true comrade. That is one of the greatest antidotes to that internal Satanism, this fourth form of Satanism that exists. So I hope that my opening remarks tonight were insightful. We're all on a journey of trying to find our way to awaken and stop living biologically and really take on a human existence and change the world. That's what we're trying to do. And as we do that, we challenge each other. We push back against each other. We push for each other to awaken more closely. That's what we do. We're on a mission. We're on a journey. This is a collective operation. Over 1,000 live streams. This is live stream number 1,004 and 1,005. Can you believe it? We're on a journey together. We're on a journey together. And we're walking on the great road. We are walking on the great road. And sometimes it's very comfortable, and sometimes it's rocky and difficult, and we're walking on the great road. Join the Center for Political Innovation. Learn to transcend living biologically and awaken. Great things are happening in this world. I believe that the world is not going to hell. The world is going toward God. And great things are happening, and the human spirit will not be defeated. And globalism and imperialism and the rule of the Western bankers is going to be ended. And humanity is going to awaken like you never believed. But all of us have agency, and all of us have a role to play in this. And my goal is to help you find the power within yourself to build something new and beautiful and truly awaken and truly take on a human existence.